Purging of Ruen, Abridged, Episode 14. "This doesn't make sense," the derby cried, pushing the wall while coughing at fumes. "How can this passage just end?" "This is a castle, the derby," Oscar said, examining the junction of wall and floor. "It's all about defence, designed with sliding walls and dead ends to confuse and disorientate invaders." "But we're not invaders," she cried. "We're quite the opposite. We want to leave." Oscar took a deep breath of fetid air, which he immediately regretted. No longer caring about autumns or councils or yachts, he just wanted to get out of the place and go home. Retching, he wiped some spittle from his chin. When the derby doubled over in a fit of coughs, Oscar struggled to refrain from the same. "What on earth is that stench?" he growled. The fumes physically clawed their insides. It reminded him of the second autumn. He would not survive a third. With the derby pleading as she had when dangling from her moped, Oscar found a sudden resolve. They had survived that ordeal, so he'd ensure they survived this. They needed air, and quite a lot of it. The torch in one paw, he grabbed the derby with the other and pulled her back toward the stairs. But with throat raw, she managed no more than a paw before succumbing. When she collapsed, Oscar pulled at her frantically, though she responded with little more than wet gurgling noises. With his lungs feeling like Hessian bags full of gravel, he dragged her back toward the parapet. To haul her up its steps, he had to surrender the torch. It skittled across flagstones, shed embers and died. Plunged into a thick black, the stench overwhelmed and ripped his lungs with every intention of evicting them. With curses he wasn't even aware of, he heaved her up another step, after which he tried a rolling manoeuvre using the curved wall as a ramp. Half a turn of spiral higher, and the derby roused enough to clamber herself. With each stair higher, the air became less rancid, and the stone tinged a silver blue. When they burst from the parapet and collapsed onto battlement, they lay for a time, panting beneath stars and grateful for the cold air. Oscar struggled to his paws and staggered to the battlement's edge. Remaining where she was, the derby asked, "Where are all the animals? I would have thought an undertaking such as this would have the place teeming. Don't you wonder where they all are?" Staring into the courtyard, Oscar said, "Not anymore." Scrabbling to her paws, she hurried to join him, and the sight below had her heave again. The courtyard was bathed in amber, and in it stood 13 enormous, heavily tensioned catapults. Their arched wood and bent bows were tight with rigging, and their carved lines held a pure mathematical elegance that glistened beneath starlight like freshly cut soapstone. Upon each, their sludge of fermented liquid manure steamed in vaults, ready to make the second autumn look like a dandelion-covered meadow beneath summer-scented sky. Black treacle oozed from them and slopped to the ground in puddles of grease so revolting that even the word grease wanted nothing to do with them. There was a throb to the things, an eagerness to unleash, and a startling fragility despite their size. The derby was beside herself, horrified certainly, but stunned at the extent her talents had been extrapolated. Despite their grievous monstrosity, she found them breathtaking and muttered things along these lines, most of which were founded in expletives. But Oscar didn't hear a word, wondering how on earth they could stop the things doing some very serious flinging indeed. Animals fled across the courtyard, abandoning the castle's keep, and wove between the catapults as though they'd become sculptures all too familiar. "There must be a main trigger rope," Oscar said. "If confusion reigns down there, we can use that to our advantage." When the battlement shook, the derby broke her stare from the weapons. "Do you think the castle will collapse?" "I shouldn't think so. It's no doubt suffered over its thousands of years, but it's still standing to this day, which is answer enough." When the rumbling flared again, he added, "Though I'd like to put out that I'm not an expert on such matters, or indeed on anything particularly." A muffled split thundered from the keep, and they cringed. What happened in there, Oscar? He shrugged. I can only assume that whatever preparations the Pajami had for all this madness have rendered the foundations of the place unstable. So what do we do now? He looked further along the wall. A distance away, scaffolding reached from their battlement to the courtyard below. Climb down, he said, the suggestion even more ludicrous than any of the madness they'd already come across. Upon that, the derby said, her gaze following his, we'll never manage in this light. Oscar peered down at those fleeing, but could see nothing resembling a trigger. They hurried along the battlement towards scaffolding. Retrieving a flare from his collapsible tummy, he said, by the light of this we'll descend, which will also advise your father to get a move on. He peered further over the edge and felt sick. Once we're down there, we'll split up. I'll go that way, you go over there. He pointed either side of the courtyard. If you see anything resembling a trigger, just, I don't know, yell or something. The derby swallowed some sick of her own. I don't know whether I can do this. Oscar fiddled with the flare. It sizzled and shot high into the air, displacing the night with an amber hue. Don't worry, he said, climbing over the battlement and putting a tentative paw onto scaffold. Neither do I. From the edge of the courtyard, Oscar crept toward one of the catapults. It towered above him and hummed with an eagerness to release the strain upon its frame. Its congealing puddle of filth made the air wilt, and the container above spat and boiled like a vat of heated fat. The whole thing teetered in a ghastly, half-finished monumental work of crochet, and Oscar faltered beneath it, mortified at such extrapolation of the derby's talents. From the payload, a heavy plait of rope plunged into the ground, disappearing through a hole bored in the courtyard's flagstone. Glancing at the weapons beyond, he saw they too were strung the same way. He turned to scour the courtyard's rear, realizing their ropes had to converge there. With the place now deserted, he bolted into its shadows and hurried along its perimeter until coming across a cage. In it was a massive weight of bound rope, as thick as a tree. It rose from the chasm to anchor heavily into the battlement wall. Above the mass, an assembly of string wove through an elaborate pulley arrangement. It sang with tension and begged to be cut. He rattled the cage. Its door was locked and there was no means of getting in. Not that it mattered. Locating the trigger was one thing, but doing something about it was quite another. His concerns became academic then, when more rumbling had flakes of stone splitting from the wall's anchoring. He stared in horror. The trigger no longer mattered. It wasn't the wall holding back the catapults so much as the catapults pulling down the wall. It seemed that the purging of Ruen would be unleashed regardless. There was no stopping the inevitable after all. Behind him, a velvety voice arose. Fate has a way of weeding out those undeserving. Oscar closed his eyes and swore. Turning, he faced Sedovitz Tapanu, unconvinced he could battle wits with vanity again, especially with bits of wall shedding all over the place. How's your jaw? Oscar asked dryly. Sedovitz laughed, but did not permit even a single point of score. My jaw is magnificent, Oscar Teabag-Dooven, just like the rest of me, in fact. My allowing your limp-pawed swipe was merely a part of a ruse, I'm afraid, an excuse for my leaving proceedings in order to perform a certain imperative task of string snipping. He threatened Oscar with a shiny pair of scissors. The thing about brilliance, Sedovitz continued, is that it stems not from complexity so much as simplicity. The castle thudded, and a dull boom ricocheted through the courtyard, leaving the wall to shed chunks of stone rather than just flakes of the stuff. The problem with stupid animals, Sedovitz said, is not so much that they're stupid as you suggested, but rather their conviction otherwise. That's what I meant, you stupid animal. Do you honestly think your garbled attempt at foiling this brilliance has the slightest hope of stopping it? Years this has taken us, Dooven. Years of scheme and plot. Do not imagine your improvised interference has impaired it in the slightest. A muffled thump highlighted his ridiculous claim, and both cats cringed. Are you seriously suggesting this mess is all part of your plan, Sedovitz? Not at all. Only that brilliance stems from simplicity, and simplicity has a certain robustness about it. He snipped his scissors again. Regardless of any mess, I merely need to cut a string, and everything will proceed as planned. There was a clap of thunder and a violent shake of courtyard. The place is falling apart, Oscar swore. Perhaps, but do not believe for a moment it was due to luck or skill on your part. The corridor was rigged so all flagstones would collapse if the necessity arose. The necessity? Indeed. Less guests displayed displeasure and decided to leave. This anticipation was in the end quite warranted, it seems. Oscar was lost for words. The castle of Ruen is ancient, Sedovitz said, and as robust as its design might be, age brings fragility. It is unfortunate that in the end so many flagstones were triggered simultaneously, as the foundations have clearly not held. He leaned closer and hissed, So do not think it any ingenuity on your part, cat. Splattering through dust, Oscar was bereft of words, until the derby appeared uncertainly from the shadows. With a surge of hope, he tried for distraction so she could approach. Your breath is really appallingly fishy, Sedovitz, he said. What do you floss with? Used fishing line? Sedovitz's eyes narrowed. Your attempts at riling me hardly matter, Dooven. What will be, because nothing can shake the paw of fate. The phrase sounded silly, and Oscar scoffed. Shouldn't that be stave? What? I think you'll find the expression is stave the paw of fate, not shake it. That just sounds silly, uneducated, and pretentious. You dare defy me? Well, that would imply there was something in you worthy of defying. I find you amusing, Sedovitz. Nothing more. And your ranting is only curious because of its stupidity. Stupidity? Have you seen what I've created? Oscar blinked at him. What? Mess? And yes, you are stupid. Quite abysmally so. Why on earth would you be shaking fate's paw anyway? Are you fate's friend or something? Actually, I am, and more than you could ever know. I understand fate to underpin the inevitable. As a consequence, I am free of the shackles binding those who look to others for validity. I am my own master. Well, that sounds like clever rubbish to me. You wouldn't understand what I know to be true. Well, that's because I'm not stupid, said Oscar. Anyway, fat lot of good it's done you, because it appears your little operation of purge has all but fallen apart. One would hope you'd have thought things through a little better, but you're stupid. I'm surprised you got this far, frankly. With a whirl, Sedovitz grabbed Oscar's paw, twisted it, and pointed the scissors at his throat. In a second, I could render you pawless, you dishevelled little runt, he snarled. How dare you hit me? How dare you interfere with the turning arc of fate? I should have finished you when I had the chance. Struggling for breath, Oscar gurgled something about a misunderstanding. I shall crush your paws, Sedovitz growled, and then insert them into your head to return some balance to your ridiculous shape. Oh, the nausea of your hideous form. With a strangled mew, Oscar struggled to gape at the derby. But when she stepped from the shadows, it was deliberate, and made no attempt to take advantage of surprise. In fact, she sidled up to Sedovitz as though he were holding an empty paper bag that had contained nothing more than another bag. Did you create this? She whispered, staring at the weapons. Surprised, Sedovitz turned to her. Apparently besotted by the scale of engineering, she said, Never would I have conceived of such scale, such extrapolation of fermentation. This is quite extraordinary. This is quite brilliant. Sedovitz dropped Oscar like a used tissue containing something nasty. Did my work lead to this? She asked. He raised his whiskers and nodded. What insight you have, Thedovitz! What genius must have been implemented to calculate even the pressure scalings of canisters such as these? To Oscar's astonishment, she began skipping around the one beside them and pointing at it. Despite everything, Thedovitz, despite it all, this is beautiful. And because she didn't lisp once, Oscar lost all will. Surrendering, he slumped to the ground, uttered an apology to the loud purr, and waited for the end. Sedovitz glanced at him. Just so we're clear, my ignoring you is pointed insult rather than careless distraction. She may have betrayed me, but I know well that the Derby recognizes brilliance. How, Sedovitz? She cried, bounding to him and taking his paw as a younger sister might her elder brother. How did you manage? Where did you start? He spoke then only to her. Had his paws been dirty, the only attention he'd have given Oscar would have been as something to wipe them on. Is it not obvious? I simply extrapolated your mechanics of constrained fermentation. But how, Thedovitz? And where? Upon this scale?